So this is the session on data write back to data warehouse in Fabric from Power BI with Power Apps. I'm super happy that that you guys before Lily and Frederick showed the data activator for Fabric as well. I think all of these integrations that allow end users to do more with their data and be more actionable is really, those are the topics that are dear to my heart. And this session that I'll be presenting now is another one of those integrations. Before we get into the weeds of it, just super briefly about myself. My name is Jon. I'm a consultant based in Copenhagen, Denmark, working for a company called Inspire, and I do all kinds of solutions in Fabric and Power Platform, and especially the intersection between those two, as briefly mentioned. And the agenda for the next 45 minutes or so, hopefully a little shorter, so there's time for questions, etc. as well, is that I'll show you what a write-back solution in Power BI with a Fabric backend can look like, talk you through a little bit of the prerequisites for getting started, and then we'll basically take the story from A to Z. How do we actually build such an extension application with Power Apps? Maybe there's a little bit of pre-cooked stuff in there, but more or less you'll see the entire journey and see how fast it can be done. And then we'll recap with a bit of, any pitfalls you need to be aware of or stuff like that. So to get to it, a brief solution demo. I'll swap over to my browser here. And I hope you guys can still see my, that you can see my browser now. I have, shout if you can't, let's put it that way. I have a report here, which is, it's a Power BI report built on top it's a semantic model that connects to a Fabric data warehouse with some Contoso data. The left-hand side is the sort of boring stuff. That's just a Power BI report with a field parameter that toggles between showing sales, returns, discount, and a little bar chart. And I've drilled down to see sales, in this case, by individual email addresses. And I can see that there's some guy called Alfredo that has a lot of sales, and there's a surprise, a generic email with some sales as well. And the magic of the solution, or what I really wanted to show, is that the integration I want to show how to build is, how can we build a Power App that can manipulate the data that we're seeing in our dashboard live, right? So in this case, you might have guessed it, that generic email 3 was probably not the email that was originally in my data warehouse. That's a value that I have provided, that I have written back to the data warehouse. You can see the right-hand side of the dashboard here. The report is essentially 3 different Power Apps, of which today the middle one is going to be the focal point. I do a couple of these kind of Power Apps extension sessions. So I have one as well on how to build a ChatGPT extension inside of Power BI. I have one on doing sort of inline comment annotations. But today we're doing the live data write back directly into the data warehouse, data which will be reflected live inside of other visualizations. And just to give you a brief demonstration of what this is able to do, I can click the generic email at gmail.com in this case, and I can use this app to provide a new email here, right? So I could put generic email 4 if that's what I wanted. I can click a submit button, and hopefully, praying to the live demo gods and everything, right, we'll see my visualization run a visual update, and now the value is generic email 4. And that's a value that's been updated live in my Fabric data warehouse, and now is reflected in my report, right? And the case that I'm showing here is, I've called it a master data management app. That's just one potential use case, right? In this case, I'm saying, I want to either remap the email, the product name, or the country of a selected item in my report. But other use cases for this that I have seen commonly is something like building a budget engine in Power Apps, in which you'd like some kind of dynamic user input for budget values that are then live visualized in the report, giving some kind of interactive feedback, or leveraging the calculation engine of Power BI to perform calculations and visualizations that might not be possible to do within Power Apps standalone, and conversely use the input possibilities of the Power Apps to accomplish something that's inputs is not really something that Power BI does very well, right? And the kicker of all of this, of course, being that our centralized underlying data storage here is a Fabric data warehouse. So that's kind of the solution demo, and this is the app that we'll be building together today, more or less. Are there any questions before we get into the weeds of it? Otherwise, I'll simply just get into cooking. If there are any questions in the chat, it'd be very helpful if somebody wants to maybe just speak up, as I can't see the chat during the sharing of the screen.
I'll jump in if there's any questions, John.
Awesome. Appreciate that very much. Thank you so much. Yeah, so questions welcome along the way, and also I'll try to make time at the end for some. So very briefly, back to the slides here. I like to be as minimal on slides as possible and as maximal as possible on live demos. So I'll stay here very briefly. Just a quick note on sort of the prerequisites for doing this integration. The data write back to Fabric will only work for you when you're using Fabric data warehouses and not data lakehouses. The reason being that we have to leverage the SQL endpoint of the storage, and lakehouses are read-only on their SQL endpoint, while warehouses are read and write. More about that in a second. Secondly, you will need a Power Apps license to build these extensions. So in addition to your Fabric and Power BI licensing, whatever you're doing in your organizations, you will need a Power Apps license, and it's not enough, unfortunately, with a standard license. Most larger Microsoft Enterprise licenses comes with Power Apps Basics that allows you to build Power Apps based on SharePoint for free, for example. But the app that we'll be building today will use a combination of SQL connectors and also a little bit of Power Automate integration, and you will need a premium connector for that. But with that said, let's jump back into it and actually try to build a Power App here. And I'm gonna start from the very beginning and assume that we have listeners on the call who have not built Power Apps before. And then we're gonna build layer on layer, and some of it will be slightly more complex when we get into the middle of things. So when you want to build Power Apps in Power BI or in Fabric in general, you can start either from the Power Apps platform, create an app, and then afterwards integrate it into your Power BI report. But what I find is a much better development experience is actually to create your Power App from inside of your Power BI report. The way it works is simply that when you create or edit a Power BI report, there is a native visualization called Power Apps for Power BI. And what happens when you put that visualization into a Power BI report is that at first it will be completely blank and it has a bit of sort of tutorial description how to get started. But really the way that the visualization works is that it accepts a number of data fields. You will have to provide it at least one data field for it to sort of create a connection between Power Apps and Power BI. But I can feed it any number of I could put something like a brand name and product name here into the visualization. I could put a measure for total sales. And now it'll say, well, either choose an app that I've already built, or I can create a new one. As a small extra tip here, you can think of the Power Apps for Power BI data fields here, just like you're building a table. So what I find really helpful before I jump into the Power App, if I want to build a Power App which uses data coming from my Power BI report, and I want to know what data I'm passing through, you can always just look at this visualization as a table first, and it will show you what kind of data that you are passing to the Power App. So this visualization, of course, will be filtered based on whatever I'm clicking on. Right now, I've already filtered down to a product name, a brand name, a total sales. But of course, if I were to drill up here, you'd see that this table would expand. And if I turn this table back into a Power Apps visualization, all of that data that you saw on the table is what will be sent to the Power App. So it's just a nice way for you to understand what data is being passed. When we have put the data in the Power Apps visualization that we are happy with, I can add more later, no problem, but I can click Create New, right? I can create a new Power App. It'll just take a second to spin up the Canvas App Studio here. For those of you who haven't seen that before, I won't go into complete detail about how the Canvas App Studio here works, but I did just want to show you that same, this is the interface in general. We have a tree view here on the left that shows all of the components that you can that you've added to your Power App, and you can, from this insert panel, you can add through a very nice drag and drop-ish GUI. You can add all of the controls to the Power App that you want, and hopefully after today you will find that that is not such a daunting task after all. When I create a new app like this, it just has like a gallery for showing data, and you can see it's actually already connected to this thing called Power BI integration.data. And that is actually those fields that I was showing you just before that I was adding to my report, the brand name, product name, total sales amount. Those will show up in this data table called Power BI integration.data. And you can see now that I have these three columns. Well, this was the table I was showing you before. And if we're really lucky, the connection hasn't broken yet. If I go ahead and go into one of these items, if we're really lucky, the data inside of the Power Apps will actually be filtered live, even though it's in a separate browser window. We'll see if that works. My internet connection apparently is not very happy with my filtering right now. You can see that it's just spinning, or maybe it's my Fabric report altogether. But when you're building Power Apps, the reason why I'm doing this in the browser right now and not in Power BI Desktop is because this integration actually usually works pretty well, in that even though you have Power Apps open in a separate window, you'll be able to filter that window, that Power App, when you're adding filters to your Power BI report in the other window. I think this is just stuck for a second. Let's try and just reload this. And I will open the existing Power App in edit mode and create our app for this session in there anyway, just because we'll be able to reuse a little bit of the sizing, and if there are any formulas we want to copy paste and stuff like that. So let's hope that my Fabric data warehouse wants to play nice here. It is sometimes a little slow to load. I accidentally left a data flow running with append set on for a long time, so I think there are hundreds of millions of rows of my data in my data warehouse currently. So hopefully this one will load. Let's just give it a second. Sometimes it's just gotta warm up again. Otherwise we'll just jump into the app and start building. While this is spinning, doing its thing, other quick notes here about this integration. I said that premium Power Apps licenses is necessary for this connection to work, and that is true when you want to do write back to the original data warehouse, as we're doing here. But if I were to build a Power Apps extension that only displays data inside of the app, say this comment app I have up here, you can actually do that with just a standard license. So the only reason we need premium licenses is because we want to write data back to the original data source. Now it works here again. I'll open up the existing app that I have here. Once you've saved it and everything, you can open that by going into edit mode, clicking the Power Apps visualization, and going to the menu and click edit. And this will open the existing app in a new browser window. And hopefully we can see that live filtering take place that I was just talking about, if we're really lucky. And don't mind the little visual bug that will happen here that will disappear in, when we save the report again. So let's see if we can at least get this report to filter. Now this time I've selected Alfredo here. I can select, hopefully this works well. Generic email has been selected. Okay, so my report is working again. And now if I go into Power Apps and I can create a new screen by clicking new screen, I could add a gallery and put that data in there. Oh, classic. Put in a vertical gallery. We can say the data source should be Power BI integration.data. And we can this time see that there is only one row of data being passed in. So when you're developing in Power Apps, if you've opened the Power Apps window from inside of Power BI, it will keep sort of the filters from Power BI while you're developing, which is super neat, with the caveat that it has a tendency to break, and you'll find yourself saving, closing, and reopening a few times. Let's put it that way. But it is nice while it works. Anyway, the screen we'll be creating today is this layout, more or less, on this new screen that I just created. So we'll be putting in some static labels. We'll be creating a manual dropdown. We'll be creating a disabled field that will look up the chosen value within Power BI. We'll create an empty text input for the user to provide their own value. And then actually the toughest part of today will be, well, one thing is we can look up data coming from Power BI. We can put in a new value here. How do we patch that back to the data source? And that's going to be where the magic happens. So let me go ahead and just say what's the sizing of this, 300, 950. I'm just going to be a little fast about that in the interest of time. So I have here an empty screen. I've created a new screen for my Power App, and the way that you would go ahead and develop a Power App from here is that we can, well, do basic formatting, give it a little bit of color, and then we can start inserting controls. And it is really just drag and drop. You either go to the insert menu at the top or on the left-hand side. We can search for all kinds of different controls, and we can put in, well, text labels. And these text labels, you can simply double-click and format it as if it was, I don't know, a PowerPoint graphic element, right? And we can say, well, this is a write back extension for Fabric. And we can highlight this and make the text bold and increase the text size and change the color of the text. And it's, I mean, basic Power Apps building is as simple as that for those of you who have not seen that before. Just doing a couple more of these text labels just for those sort of titles that we have had on the left-hand side of the screen here, the choose dimension, the old value, and the new value. I can simply copy paste, like I also maybe would have done in PowerPoint. We're not going to hit the formatting exactly right, but let's say this is choose dimension. We want to display an old value, and we want to display a new value. Right. So for the choose dimension, we obviously want that to be a dropdown, so the user could toggle between whether they wanted to override this column of data or this column of data or this column of data. So again, I'm going to go to insert and I'm going to search for dropdown and put in a dropdown to my slide here. Format that. It's a little large here. Formatting will not be the emphasis of today's session, but hopefully you'll get the point anyway. And for the purpose of this demonstration, I'll just hard code some values into this dropdown. But you could also have this dropdown populated by an array, a table coming from your data warehouse or from a SharePoint list if you wanted to maintain those values elsewhere. But for now, I'm simply just going to type in a couple of options here. What was the other values again? It was country and product name. Gotcha. Country and product name. That will give us a dropdown with those three options. We'll create a, well, I'll do it as a text input field, just because I think formatting wise, it looks decent. Can we do the text a little smaller here? 14. Okay. And for this old value box, we want to look up the selected value in Power BI, the currently selected value. And not only do we want to select the currently selected value, we want to return the selected value of whatever dimension has been chosen here, so that if the user selects email on the dropdown, it's the email that we're displaying in old value. If they select product name, it's the product that they're displaying, because really we want the user to be able to see what value they are overwriting. So we're going to alter this default property. The way that Power Apps are built up is of, well, you have screens, and screens have a number of controls, and each control has a number of properties. And really every time I've been adjusting font size and colors, it's different properties of the controls that I've been adjusting. And now I want to update the default property of my text input control here so that I can look up the existing value in the Power BI report. Just in the interest of time, I'll copy the formula here and I'll explain what it's doing. It's a simple switch statement that we're going to use. So on this default button here. I'll go ahead and switch on the value of dropdown 3. Now, best practice would be to rename your controls, right? So this dropdown would be dropdown choose dimension. And now it would be very easy for me to in here see that it's the selected value of dropdown choose dimension that I'm switching over. When the value is email, I want to return the email address of the first object in Power BI integration.data. And now whenever we're clicking in Power BI, there's only ever going to be one item in this table, as we already saw. You can also see a preview down here, but you do need the first here because the Power App does not know that there will only be one item in this table. So you'll have to wrap this in a first formula and then add which column to return. And here will be the intelligence when you write these formulas will help you by making all of the columns that you added to your visualization available for you to see when you add this stop after the data table. So here I can choose to display my email address whenever email has been selected in the dropdown. Similarly, when product name is selected, I want to return the product name. When country is selected, I want to return region country name. And now it works just so that if I change my dropdown to country, it will display the corresponding value that has been filtered in my Power BI report. So that's how we can pass dynamic filters or dynamic values from Power BI to Power Apps, is by checking sort of what are the selected values in Power BI, and we can use that any way we want. We can filter using all kinds of operators in Power Apps if we want. We can check if a value is equal to X, then do Y. If another value is equal to A, then do B, etc., etc. One last thing we want to do with this old value is that we don't want the user to be able to edit this box. So we can use another property of this control, the display mode, and change that from display mode edit to display mode disabled. And it will display it as a sort of nice grayed out box. So the user knows that that's not something they can interact with. Just a little bit of UX in there. Let's create a new text input. Go. Format that slightly, a bit of a smaller text. And now this is obviously the input where we want the user to add their new value. So we don't want to do any default value here. So I'm actually going to delete the default property here. Instead, I'm just going to add a little bit of hint text. And the quick observer might have seen that sometimes I go up here and find some properties. Sometimes I use this right-hand menu. They are essentially mirrors of each other. And this is just a graphical user interface representation of the list up here. So if I want to edit the hint text, I can find it up here, hint text, or I could go over here and say, enter your input here. And it'll show up as a little bit of a hint text. If I now go ahead and preview my app, this is fully functional, right? I can go ahead and change the drop-down values, and I can input new values. So far, so good. How do we actually take the next step and push this data back to the data source? That's kind of why we're here, right? That's the meat of it. And I'll start out by showing you how we can actually ingest data from the data warehouse to a Power App. So far we've been using this, we've been using data coming directly from Power BI as the data source in my Power App. But there is also a menu in Power Apps called data, in which I can add a number of data sources. So I could go into add data here, and I can look for the SQL Server connection. I can create, I wonder if this is actually a pre-made one for my data warehouse. Otherwise, we can find it. So if I go into Fabric, I have here a warehouse created in my workspace. If I go into the settings of that warehouse, I can find this SQL connection string that allows me access to the SQL endpoint of the data warehouse. So I can paste this in to my SQL connection in Power Apps. I'll have to provide it with the exact database name as well. It's a little difficult to figure out, but it's actually just the name of your warehouse. So if I put in Contoso warehouse, it should hopefully allow me to connect. It does, and I can select the table to use here. And I could connect to, DIM employee. We'll see that appear here in my Power App, and I can now use this data inside of the Power App. So I could add in a gallery here, and I could point it to dim employee, and it will show me data that is in my Fabric warehouse. You can see here there's a guy called Kirk Neeson and Aaron Painter who's working in marketing, and that's me reading data from the Fabric data warehouse. And wouldn't it be nice if we couldn't just we can read data from the warehouse into Power Apps, if we couldn't also just write data back? Well, it turns out that unfortunately it doesn't work exactly as easy as that. The first time I tried this, I really had my hopes that it would work, but I'll show you what happens if you try to do this. So let me go back to the screen we already have working and just copy this. Can I not select these? Go to this screen here, just so we can see what's happening. So it's actually this formula that I want here. Okay, to talk you through a little bit, this button here that allows us to submit data, how can we do that? Well, the first thing I want to do is capture the value of the dimension here, which has information about which column I want to override. I want to define a value about the value to be overwritten, and I want to define what is the value that is supposed to override the existing value. So what I do is actually I use a CTE. As you might know it from SQL, right? In Power Apps, it's a with statement to define a couple of variables. In this case, I'm defining the variable table to write, column name, old value, and new value. And the way that I define it is simply I say, well, depending on the drop-down value, let me just change this to DD choose dimension, just so we're on the right page here. If country is selected, the table that I want to write to is the DBO dim customer. If it's product name, then it's the dim product, etc., etc. Same story for column name. If the selected value is country, I want the column to be updated to be region country name. If it's email, I want it to be the email address, so on and so forth. The old value is super easy for us to get because that's just whatever value is currently being displayed in the one text input. This one is right now called text input 3. Not really best practice, but I'm sure you will excuse me. And the new value to be displayed is, of course, text input 4. That makes sense. So these 4 values are being stored when I click this button. That's the first thing that happens. And then if we just ignore this part up here, what I really wanted to show you, the normal way we usually patch data in Power Apps is we use this patch formula, and we patch a destination data source, in this case, dim customer, and we patch it by doing a lookup where we say, well, I want to override where email address equals the old value, and I want to provide it with the new value. But what happens when you do this is that it will actually throw us an error. I really hope that it would display it here. We can see it in here then maybe. It says here, this data source is either read-only or has no primary key, so the function patch can't write to it. And that was the headache I first faced when I tried to do write back to Fabric data warehouses from Power Apps. It seems like the lack of enforced primary keys, which is it's just a, well, call it a feature or a bug. It's a given in Fabric data warehouses that we cannot enforce primary keys. That apparently breaks the patch functionality within Power Apps, meaning that even though we've added the data source as a SQL data source inside of the Power App, we're actually unable to write data to the source. That's a bummer. But there is a workaround, of course. Otherwise, the session would be quite worthless, right? The workaround is that while this patch statement does not work, writing pure SQL against the write-enabled endpoint of the data warehouse does work. We cannot submit pure SQL code from within Power Apps, but we can do that from within Power Automate. And it's actually surprisingly easy to integrate a really, really simple yet dynamic Power Automate flow to handle this for us. So what I've done is that I've gone into the Power Automate pane here inside of Power Apps, and I've added a new flow, and I've called it Fabric Writeback. And this very simple Power Automate flow is it's an instant flow, meaning that it's triggered when you click a button, and we can then configure our Power Apps button to be the button that triggers this flow. It accepts 4 different variables as input. Those would be the 4 variables that I showed you we were building with the CTE, with the with function before, the table to write, the column name, the old value, and the new value. And then there is a simple execute a SQL query action in here. I'm providing it with a server name, a database name, and now this demo was built back when I was none the wiser, and I accidentally used the Dataflow staging warehouse as my destination. You probably shouldn't do that. I should probably be using my Cartoso warehouse. But really the query then that I'm going to send to this warehouse is just that I'm going to say, well, update the table to write, set the column name that I want to override to new value, where the column name is old value. So in plain text, that could be update the dim customer and set the email equal to new email, where email equals old email, right? Or generic email 3 should now be generic email 4. And then if I wanted to, I could even pass a variable back to my Power Apps, and I could do some error handling if I wanted to make this app even better, even nicer, and sort of give the user some feedback as to whether, what do I know, maybe the write back failed or something like that, right? I could build that into the flow pretty easily. But this flow here, when that's created, is really, really easy to run from inside of our Power App here. So all we need to do is after our initializing these 4 variables, instead of using the patch formula down here, I'm simply using I'm simply calling the flow .run. So you just put the name of the Power Automate flow and add .run. And then in the parentheses here, you can say it asks for the 4 different string variables that I want to pass it, because the flow is expecting 4 values. And I'm just passing in the 4 variables that I defined in my CT. So I'm passing table to write, column name, old value, and new value, and that's the end of that. The last little piece of magic that's happening on this button is that, we don't need this right now, is that I'm calling another function of Power BI integration. So first I explained to you that there was Power BI integration.data, which is able to show us data that's currently being filtered in Power BI. There's another operator on the Power BI integration source here, data source, that's called refresh. And what this is going to do is that it's going to trigger a visual refresh of our Power BI report. And that means that the user does not need to refresh their browser window at all. We are going to trigger a visual refresh of all of the data visualizations. And because Power Apps functions run in sequence, this formula will only run after the actual Power Automate flow is finished running. So we can patch whatever change we want to through that SQL statement to our data warehouse. And then after that's done, we're going to call a visual refresh, and we're going to see, hopefully, the change happening live in front of our eyes. So just to go back and show you what that looks like, right? If I select generic email 4 again, this works, right? If I put in here generic email 5@gmail.com, what's going to happen when I click on this button is that it's going to store 4 variables in local memory. It's going to say, well, okay, because you chose email as the dimension, it's going to, in the table to write variable, it's going to save the DBO dim customer as the column to be changed. It's going to take the email address. For the value to be overwritten, the old value is going to take whatever is in this disabled input. And in the new value, it's going to take whatever I put in the text input. Then it's going to say, well, I want to run my Fabric write-back Power Automate flow with these 4 variables as parameters. And when that's succeeded, I want to do a visual refresh of all visualizations in the report. And that's why you'll see when I click this button, in just a second, it will show that spinning wheel that you all know on all of the visualizations in here, because it's essentially the same as clicking this refresh button up here. So if I click submit, we'll see this first runs all the little ants, and now we see all the visualizations are refreshing, and hopefully in a second, this updates to generic email 5@gmail.com. And we could go into the data warehouse and see that change happen in there, but I hope you'll take my word for it that is indeed what's happening here. So that's essentially it. That's how you build a data write-back solution to a Fabric data warehouse in Power BI. And just to sort of recap the small changes here. The reason why you might want to do this is because we can create really, really interactive experiences for the user in Power BI with the use of Power Apps extensions. Now, I showed you the write back extension here, right, which could be used to build budget engines or very extensive comment additions. I've seen some great use cases in finance departments for user providing input on outstanding purchase order accruals so that finance can forecast their spend in the coming months. And that application is significantly enhanced by using Power BI to display to the end user all of the items they're responsible for and create data visualizations they can use in addition to it. And that integration of being able to then write data inside of the application directly back to the data source and have that data source immediately change the visualizations is just really powerful. Much more powerful than, say, having the app stand alone in a separate browser window, doing your inputs, and then jumping back over to a different screen, waiting an hour for your ETL processes to run, and then you have an updated report. So this instant live integration between Power Apps and Power BI is simply crazy powerful. The one caveat when using Fabric, which makes it a little more difficult to do it with Fabric than, say, a regular Azure SQL Server or even just a Dataverse database, would be that the lack of enforced primary keys on the Fabric data warehouse means that we have to go the roundabout way of doing raw SQL statements in Power Automate to accomplish this. And it's actually not possible at all with lakehouses as it is right now. Simply due to the nature of how they're built. But it works and performance is great. Frankly, it's a very, very common scenario in Power Apps to use Power Automate as sort of the gateway to write data to any data source, especially when the amounts of data starts increasing. Performance will be much better if you use Power Automate anyway. So you shouldn't think of this as being sort of like a hacked workaround. In many cases, especially larger amounts of data, this would be best practice to do it this way anyway. Maybe you'll modify your Automate flow slightly, but the notion of using both Power Apps and Power Automate to accomplish this is not an over-engineered concept. One last thing that I want to show you that I saved for last is just a little bonus. I'm not sure how many of you know that you can integrate Power BI reports inside of PowerPoint. Well, turns out you can do that while you still have Power Apps in your Power BI reports as well. So this little slide right here is actually a Power Automate flow embedded in a Power App, embedded in a Power BI report, embedded in PowerPoint, which allows your PowerPoint users to accomplish write back to a Fabric table, which I think is completely crazy. And now I didn't reload this in a while, so it's probably not gonna work very well, right? But I could change this to Columbus new email and it will work just the same. Quick note on security and all this. All of this is AD integrated. I can only do this because the user I'm logged into on PowerPoint and in Power BI and in Power Apps and all of that is a user which has write access on the tables I'm accessing in the SQL data warehouse. You can see this worked inside of PowerPoint. I think that's completely nuts to think that we can have data write back in PowerPoint through Power BI and Power Apps. I think that's absolutely amazing. But yeah, that was kind of it. If you're curious, hopefully there's time for just a few questions. But otherwise, all I wanted to say was, if you're curious about this topic, I have a lot of other articles and resources on doing integrations with Power BI to automate and to apps for all kinds of use cases. And you're more than welcome to find me on LinkedIn. If you are curious about, I've published a bunch of articles showcasing many of these things. And if you want to get the slides from today, even though they are very sparse and just include a few screenshots, you're welcome to jump on my GitHub as well and find those there. But I guess I'll just round it off by saying, if are there any questions, and if so, I'll happily just spend a minute or two taking those.